As I began to think about what I wanted to say about digital data and technology in local government today, I kept thinking about the massive impact of COVID-19 over the past 6 months and the way that it's forced a rapid pivot in focus to support the need for an emergency response and a lockdown country, accelerating a whole range of new ways of working, not just moving people to work remotely and the rise of back to back video calls, but also the way that council staff have worked across service silos to meet people's needs, and the way that communities and the voluntary sector have stepped forwards and self organised. You all know that your town halls, customer service centres, and local offices were emptied out with maybe one or two staff working from them. In only a few days, the urgency of moving to this new operating model swept away the cultural and business case quibbling that has typically prevented rapid adoption of digitally enabled ways of working. And many of you also know the procurement and governance processes were put to one side in favour of get it done tomorrow. Before the pandemic struck, I was planning a talk on the future priorities of CDOs, CIOs, and their teams, a keynote about you and the challenges facing your teams across the country. But if there's one thing that we've learned across local government during the past 6 months, it's that the capacity, creativity, and strengths of the community have stepped up to fill gaps and meet needs. Many voices are much stronger and wiser than one. So, in that spirit, I'm not going to spend the next 30 minutes talking at you. Instead, I'm going to share with you the insights and learning from a range of people who are far closer to the day-to-day reality and strategic planning and action than I am. Thanks to a fantastic group of local government CDOs, CIOs, and transformation directors who were willing to speak to me from their sheds, spare room offices, living rooms, and even bedrooms.
Hi, I'm Kit Collingwood and I lead Digital Technology and Customer Services at the Royal Borough of Greenwich.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Carter. I'm the Corporate ICT Manager at Rugby Borough Council.
Hi, I'm Rob Miller. I'm Director of Customer Services and ICT at Hackney Council.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm Head of Digital Transformation at the London Borough of Camden.
Hi, I'm Ed. I'm the Director of Transformation at Central Bedfordshire Council.
I'm Dr. Deborah Smart. I'm Corporate Director for Digital and Change at Dorset Council.
Before the pandemic struck, I think there was a really strong focus around budget and the case for spending the level of money that we were on IT and for justifying things like the digital team and the data team that formed part of the core kind of offer to the organization. I think on a more substantial level, one of the things that's been almost universal with everyone I've spoken to, either professionally or personally, is just how impressed everyone's been with the fact that IT is kind of held out globally and they've been able to talk and see friends and colleagues and do the stuff that we're doing right now. So I suspect that if you were to look at kind of user satisfaction with basic IT over all time, this is probably as close to 100% as a profession we're ever going to get. Coming off that, as a really serious point, there is also a recognition that people have been able to use IT and adapt to IT more quickly than they ever were before. So a lot of the kind of now we'll need to do 6 months of user training and all that stuff has gone. But also, I think there's a real recognition that IT is an enabler to a lot of stuff that isn't just about the technology, and it can enable us to do things differently, and we can almost use it to stretch our imaginations in terms of what is possible. I think there is more of an acknowledgement that we need to do things differently. Certainly in the council I work for now, it's absolutely clear that going back to the way we used to do things isn't an option and won't really meet needs have evolved. The way we need to do stuff has evolved. And so I think we find ourselves both in a landscape where we need to change, but also where there is support, absolute support from across the kind of the organization and the people we serve for doing differently. So I think we have a stronger mandate for the digital and the data stuff than we've ever had before as well.
Oh, I can't even remember life pre-COVID. It's really hard to look back. So I'd kind of only just really joined Camden and was thinking about setting, like much like Kit's probably doing at the moment, setting up a digital team. So a lot of thinking about talent and capability and skills and starting to think, how can we bring in some of those people into our organization and where might some interesting talent exist within the organization as well. And also trying to think about where were the services, like Ed kind of used to talk about, in terms of being kind of ripe for change or ripe for this way of working. So I think I was scurrying around trying to make friends with people, understand who knew what digital was, who maybe like talking to the people who knew that agile wasn't about working off a laptop or working remotely, and trying to kind of suss out where we could do some interesting work. And that's definitely changed now. I mean, if anything, I've kind of been thrown more into managing an operational response to COVID, but I suppose my role is covering everything from data, tech, and digital, but starting to think about how we really bring responsive service design into our approach to the pandemic response. And now I'm starting to think again about those things before the pandemic around talent and capability, and starting to think, how can we bring some of these folk quickly into our organisation, or where can we work with others who are already doing?
When the pandemic hit, I was only 9 weeks into this job. So at that point, my priorities were sort of setting my glossary of terms and saying, what do we mean when we say digital? Much as Emma said, meeting people and building relationships and understanding the opportunities of transformation. So very like a classic first 2 months in the office. And then that was followed by instantly not classic every day since then. So my priorities immediately became data. So how do we use data to feed people and meet basic human need? So something very focused on far more basic human imperatives. So it was about technology and data, but it suddenly had a human story far more closely attached than it ever had before. And my equal priority was how to give the 4,000 staff at Greenwich the tools that they need to do their jobs. It wasn't a remote working council at all, and we made it one within a month through some very talented people working really hard. So they became it was fairly binary, those priorities, but I just wanted to reflect on how it made me feel. So it made me feel far more accountable than I ever anticipated being that early in the job. So a huge sense of responsibility that if you don't do something, some really fundamental needs won't get done. And that includes giving our staff the tools they need to do their job, because that is a fundamental, particularly in service delivery, it's a fundamental need. I feel far more emotionally entwined with this job this early than I ever thought I would be, because of the same reason. And I live in the borough that I serve as well. And that makes me feel an additional imperative to help. I feel far more strongly intertwined with my local community and with this community. So I don't know whether you lot agree, but the local government CDOs network is far more bonded than we ever would have been had we not had a pandemic, because we've shared in a way that I don't think any of us would have anticipated sharing, and that includes our feelings and our worries. So I'm very grateful for that. And I feel more intertwined with the organisation as well. So, selfishly, it's given me a greater platform for action, because I've had to be relied on as a leader before the trust networks were ready for me to do that, being so new in the job. So it was a silver lining to a cloud, that. And then the next phase, given that Emma expanded the question, I'll expand it as well. The next phase of this is that I think we now go forward in the same way that I would have done 6 months ago. So I've written a digital strategy. We will now start to hire. We've started some key service transformations already. But I think we're going to do that enriched by the knowledge that we've gained so far, and driven more by the financial imperative. So we've got the same financial woes as many other councils do. So there's an extra imperative, and it's a scary amount of money, but we're enriched by the knowledge, and we're that much stronger going forward. I can't believe I just said going forward. We're far stronger, and just edit the rest of it out.
We were at the end of developing our digital strategy, which was going to approval to council. Now it hasn't even gone to approval to council at this stage yet. Still, again, we sort of want to do a lot of reworking around how we've worked with the COVID situation, and how we've obviously supplied the organisation with the ability to work remotely from home, as well as supplying them with the sort of data and requirements that they also needed. Funny enough, we were doing a lot of work on our BCP and DR just prior to that, which was, I guess, really timely as the pandemic came in, which also, helped us through the pandemic. I mean, we found that looking back on it now that we were a lot more ready for the situation than we actually thought we were going to be when it first hit. But I think, you know, the work that we'd done prior to the pandemic, as far as like infrastructure and, you know, setting up that sort of scenario, it really sort of came to light when the pandemic hit. You know, now we're like the heroes of the organisation. The team's the actual heroes of the organisation, and I think they can see sense into, you know, what we're actually putting forward and what we really want to be able to achieve as far as, you know, the digital side of things, as well as, you know, the actual IT side of things as well. I sort of feel guilty a bit about the fact that, like, there is a definite silver lining to this, and, you know, it's done digitalisation in the organisation. It's given us a huge boost, and we've achieved, you know, so much more in the past sort of 6 months than we probably did in the 2 years prior to that. Obviously, we were, you know, hugely involved in the whole preparing of data and that for the shielding hubs and the food deliveries and everything like that, which again has also pushed us to the forefront of, you know, preparing data and that for the rest of the organisation. So that's been a huge benefit as well. And I just think, as Kit was saying, we've shared so much information with other local authorities within our area, and the collaboration that's, you know, now existing has just been absolutely huge. It's really sort of brought, you know, I guess the authorities together.
I think that COVID has sharpened the focus on the things that we wanted to be doing. So I don't think, looking at what's happened over the last 6 months, whether it's made me think, oh gosh, I wish we hadn't done that, or there was a glaring gap in the things we knew we needed to do. But I think it's really sort of brought the emphasis on that, and I think it's kind of upped the pace. I think the point, there's a really strong point about how it's created a much closer working relationships across council services. So I think there's something about the urgency which it's created, which is something maybe we've put a lot of work in the team over the last few years into building trust with the organisation, and I think that's really paid dividends. But I think we've seen ourselves coming together with colleagues from across a range of services in very different ways, and with a pace of decision making, and an openness to listening to one another, which has been kind of really powerful. I think also the kind of, we've been able to sort of lean on the dividends of some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. So very quickly, our data and insight team helped us understand where some of the implications of COVID on sort of vulnerable people across the borough, and thinking about different ways in which it might impact people. And because we've been looking at how data works across different data sets, because we are in some ways building on work that's kind of been in 10 years in the working in terms of how we understand customer information, stuff which, you know, kind of previous people in our service have done, has really come into the fore now. The point about sort of the IT and digital teams kind of being able to really show their value in terms of changing, you know, supporting people in changing how they work really quickly, I think has been very powerful. And it also, for us, it happened at the same time as we were bringing technology, data, digital and customer services together as part of a single service. So that's kind of helped us kind of be part of the response in really different ways. So as well as supporting the food service for vulnerable people who were unable to get out and get food themselves, especially as the normal access to retail collapsed, we were actually part of doing the doing and running the first point of contact. It was people in the customer services teams who were talking to those people and, you know, listening to some of the calls. You can get really strong personal sense of what it's meant to people. And the bit that's been most awe-inspiring for me is how that's been seen as not just as a transactional interaction. So we've worked really closely with public health and the social care teams so that we can understand more complex needs. We've trained the customer services teams in making every contact count so they can actually have a really good conversation with people, guide them to other services they might need. So it's not just a simple, do you need food? Here's some food. It's a much more kind of rich conversation.
Before the pandemic started, you know, we're quite a new council, just coming together, forming in that new unitary. And I think very much my concerns were about getting the right people in the right posts, getting the right skills, so that we could really forge ahead with doing digital with user-centered design techniques and really helping the organization understand the benefit of that kind of approach to transformation, and what digital could do. I'd inherited some teams from across the council that hadn't worked together really very much. So also my concerns were about broadening out the digital offering to be not just seen as technology, seen as an engine of transformation, but also including the piece that I have around digital place and connectivity, because connectivity is a big issue in Dorset. We only have 5% full fibre. How did that change in the pandemic? Well, we didn't have quite so much time to spend doing perhaps workshops and face-to-face sessions to try and design sort of principles we might all work to. We had to do that kind of thing very quickly. We had to redeploy some of the team that we'd appointed to be business partners into working on particular areas to support shielding. So in fact, one of the business partners who was supporting a big piece of transformation that we were just starting was completely redeployed. She had a whole new team around her, and she managed them from scratch to do something completely different, although there was a digital element to that. So it was quite a lot of disruption in the plans that we set out. But we used that to our advantage. We helped automate things like the business grant forms that we had to implement and support our local businesses in Dorset to do. We implemented a lot of digital support around the shielding piece to try and make sense of the data that was coming from central government and how we could unpick that, as well as ask our communities to tell us about what they needed, so that we were sort of triangulating some of that. So it was very reactive. It was changing by the minute what needed to happen, both because of the nature of the pandemic, but also just the nature of the next government announcement was something different to do. And despite being a very new team and also potentially key people moving off to do other things, we kind of muddled through okay, I think.
So digital's gone front and centre of our plans to cope with what's to come, and our digital strategy covers online services, tools for the job, being data driven, building capability, and a bunch of other stuff as well. And that is, as ever, of course I believe in this, but I think it's a win-win. So it's offering people to be as much independent of the administrative burden of contacting the council as possible, to allow them to access services in a frictionless way. Same for staff, actually. And by doing that, help with the financial troubles we've got, which is the other big theme. And there's also a climate angle. There's a lot of talk in the council about everything from people are biking everywhere now. That's brilliant. How do we make sure that we cement that? To electric cars, and even just I think there's a psychology to this pandemic that we've never seen before, which is, yes, it's been horrendous and hectic, and it sucked a lot of people's time and energy, but it has forced people to think more philosophically and more strategically about things, and climate is definitely one of the things that's come out of that. And I suppose an overriding thing is about human contact. What is the nature of contact and communication, both for service delivery and for cohesion and independence and healthcare. And that seems to be a thread that the whole thing is woven through, if that makes sense.
It feels like there's a kind of, I'd say divide is too strong a word, but there's definitely a part of the organisation that is, I'd say, not embracing the new normal or whatever we mean by that, and not in a kind of, they're not doing this in a deliberate way, but they're kind of, I think it's a psychological safety thing of going back to what they used to do and having some level of control over that. And then there's a kind of part of the organisation that, so I'll be in a meeting about the MTFS, and half of the meeting will be, talking about our MTFS in the same way we used to, and half the part of the meeting will be like, can't we bring a new, different kind of approach to this? What does midterm financial planning even mean anymore? What does this mean in the light of COVID? And isn't it ridiculous to kind of put projects into a plan for 3 years, because surely this is going to change? So I think that's a really interesting, I'd say, opportunity we have. There's definitely people embracing not just kind of new ways of working, but really culturally starting to think about, what does this mean for us as an organization? So an example of that is we're really starting to rethink, what does our our kind of whole change and corporate strategy kind of bit of the organization look like? And are we too heavy on people that write papers, and do we need to be lighter on that and have more people that can do and think flexibly and kind of have more of a design kind of, I say, like doing aspect to our kind of change team as well? So we're starting to think about bringing in people that, you know, understand what policy design is, and actually having a kind of service design kind of core team and capability within the organization. And I think that stuff's super exciting. The other theme I think that is coming up, and probably lots of people around the table are thinking about, is what does this mean for the way we work going forward? So yes, I think IT has been instrumental to getting us all remote, and that's brilliant. But like, an organization can't just survive on Teams. Like, an organization can't survive on relentless back-to-back video calls. And I think it's really interesting that the longer this has gone on, the more camera off people have started to be, because of the like just pure fatigue that is setting in from being on back-to-back video calls.
Not in general, but I mean, you know, we're doing the whole virtual council meetings. I don't think anybody will ever want to come back now that they've got those. You know, they absolutely love those virtual council meetings. So
it seems very evident to me that there's a real span of different expectations about what happens next, and partly because no one really knows how long we're talking about. And I think that then kind of amplifies people's kind of like where they would like to be. So there are some people I think are really kind of trying to see this as an opportunity for dramatic change, and that when you combine that with a length of impact, you see that as a sort of really strong imperative for, we could close 3/4 of our offices, we could completely reinvent lots of services, etc., etc. On the other side, there definitely is a kind of a large body of people who just really would like this to be over and be back to normal. And then when you start to see sort of news which suggests that maybe we can sort of relax things more quickly or whatever, then that would sort of act as a break or more dramatic change. I think there's somewhere in between that, and it probably varies about depending on the different service we're talking about, where we can be bold, but we just need to be careful to not kind of imagine that we're completely throwing the whole world up in the air, because we need to understand how we carry people with us. So when we're talking about what work means, I think the suggestion that it's a mix of working from home and in the office, and maybe working in the office for different purposes, is right. So we sort of thinking about how we co-create that with the people who we're working with, rather than sort of imposing this is how we imagine it to be. I think there's lots of ways where technology can open up opportunities. So we're effectively giving people choices rather than templates and blueprints. Really interested to think about how services coming together in different ways through the pandemic allows us to design new services moving forward which don't look like the old silos, and allows us to think about services rather than structures, and those habits of having to come together and form and reform in different ways, I think, are really, really positive and exciting too. So I think there's a lot where there's a real opportunity for great ambition, but I think there's also kind of a need for us to be thoughtful about the fact that it's not like the entire world has changed. Some parts of it will remain the same, some parts of it must not go back to being the same, and some parts of it maybe we need to think about how we can make it a bit more the same than it currently feels like it would be.
So it's kind of, I mean, I think a lot of it's the same as others have already mentioned. So there's something around the way that we work, and I guess in that we're not just talking about the kind of, digital for shorthand. We're actually really trying to reflect on how the organization operates in terms of empowering the people who are kind of closest to the work, genuinely enabling people to suggest new ways of doing things. So, CBC is reasonably traditional and hierarchical, and trying to unpick some of that hierarchy and really give a voice to some of the people, I hate the term, on the front line. There's something around, we've called it a bit cheesy, getting the basics right, which is acknowledging, as we've learned through the last 6 months, that there's a ton of stuff that we do that we don't need to do. So there are some that are really simple examples. We used to print something stupid like 14,000 pages a day, and we went to printing less than 1,000 pages a day. Now, 13,000 of those pages stopped, and nothing stopped happening. There was nothing that those pages were contributing to that made the world a better place. We've started to invite some people back into the office. So directors have been going in all the way through, and I spend 2 days a week in the office. We've opened it for other people everyone, at all kind of levels in the organization, in small groups, to come in as well. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see how people react to coming into an office that is COVID secure, that has no atmosphere, is, it almost feels Machiavellian, letting people come in, but because it underlines in a way that I don't think anything else could, that the office isn't normal. There is no normal you can go back to right now working. And we're about to do a conversion of a sixth of our office into what we've called connect and collaborate space. Now, the collaborate bit was always going to be easy. The connect, which we've described as being social, it's about our social relationships with the people that we work with. In many ways, I think the kind of humanity, and I can't remember whether it was Kit or Rob who mentioned the kind of humanity that sits behind all of this, is absolutely the political forefront. And they are thinking about the ways we support people in connecting and maintaining those, informal networks that grease the wheels of the organization and that help us to think, to Rob's point, in terms of the services rather than the structures. And I'm really optimistic that the stuff that we're doing will help us achieve that. The final bit I wanted to say is, and it kind of layers on top of that, is we're in a very different position than the position I imagine I would be in if I was in Camden. So for central beds, it's been a blessing to have all these people that earn decent salaries that used to spend thousands on train tickets and then spend whatever money they had left at Pret or other places in London, actually staying in our towns, because all of a sudden they're spending money in our towns. But more than that, they're hosting netball clubs, football teams, all kinds of stuff that is creating a kind of social fabric that in many of our kind of, especially the newer towns, wasn't really there.
When we've actually now gone out to staff and said, well, what would you like to do in the future? We've got a far greater proportion of staff recognising that they don't want to drive all the way across Dorset to come to work 5 days a week. They do want to come together to do things that are highly social, and some of this service design work would fall into that. But actually, they enjoy the flexibility. They enjoy the fact that we have, with having to juggle homeschooling or caring responsibilities, we've had to be much more flexible with how we've worked. And actually, we've done far more and been far more innovative than we would have been if we'd all been sitting in the office next to each other doing our emails. And staff are reflecting that. Members also want us to look at rationalising the office estate. That was always part of the plan with coming together with the councils. So one of the key strategic themes is, how do we implement a way of working that works for staff, that works obviously for our customers and businesses in Dorset, and realises some of that property rationalisation ambition, and really is a really good offer. So we've got something like 74% of employees saying they can work 80 to 100% of their working week at home. How do we enable end-to-end digital services so that people can work from their home, go to their customer, work from their home, meet other colleagues, really thinking about reducing our carbon footprint, reducing our business mileage, which will help pay back some of the COVID overdraft, as I like to call it. So drawing those things together in a fundamentally new way of working that will be much more ambitious than we'd have ever thought about before. I think alongside and underpinning that then comes around, what is our digital approach to customers? How do we give people the tools, technologies, and enable them to work? What do we do about our data, which we've discovered isn't really as good as we might have hoped it would have been, or maybe we knew it all along, but we've started to see the flaws in that. We know exactly who's coming in to open the post because they're the only ones that have permission to come in to kind of sign documents and do that during the full lockdown. So how do we work with those teams to really transform them into a digital way of working? Some of them have been doing that as part of the ongoing kind of coming together of the services through the unitary. So one of the things that we have managed to keep going despite the pandemic was the transformation in planning with our planning colleagues. Okay. They have been working completely digitally almost through the whole pandemic. And despite the fact they've got shelves and shelves of paper, we'll have to think about what we do with that. We've now imagined a new way of working that's digital going forward. Because we have only got 5% full fibre, we've struggled then with some employees being able to actually comply with full lockdown and working from home, and in indeed, you know, our connectivity to keep some services going as a result. We've obviously had conversations going back to, if we don't all come to Dorchester, sort of 2,500 of us every day, what kind of economic impact does that have in Dorchester? And that's an interesting conversation. We're still kind of weighing up the plus side of not having 2,500 people parking in Dorchester, maybe not spending as much on the high street as other people who might come to shop. So I think it is about evolving that offer and that economic development, supporting the businesses to come back and be strong. But actually what we've noticed is people are still spending that money, but just in their local high streets or their local villages. Or so I think it's had a different economic impact. Now we've started to get back to shops opening and people tending to shop local, which I think is the same across the whole country actually, but it does then leave some pinch points where, you know, where the big places that everyone used to come to, we need to support those communities to think about how they evolve. So we've had very strong political leadership around not going back to how things were. You know, and we've kind of developed this phrase of toast can't go back to being bread. And I think that's true. So I think our employees have moved on. They want to work in a different way. They want to embrace a flexible, agile way of working. Although they're hoping that doesn't mean they have to go back to homeschooling, but they still want that flexibility to work in that way. And I think we've now got people who may not have thought much about the importance of their technology now saying to us, well, actually, if I had this, if I had the ability to do this in a mobile way, if I had more data when I was out and about, then I could transact some of this actually in customer premises or, you know, with my customers side by side. And so I think it's just helped everybody to think about things in a different way. Some of it they've just had to innovate because we've just had to adapt and you know, and adjust to the circumstances that we've got. So we've got a lot of workarounds in place, and that's making people think, well, now I can take the step forward. I can't, you know, haven't got many people saying to me, I want to take the step back and make everything go back to normal.
How very dare you ask me such a challenging question, Mr. Becker. So I think our work with communities has been really interesting. So firstly, I think there are some areas where it's just been astonishing to just observe what the community sector and communities through self-organising work have done. And I think it's demonstrated that it doesn't need the local authority to be doing things for the community just to kind of be remarkable in supporting itself. I think in some ways it reminds me of discussions that we were having a long time ago when I was at Lambeth about at the time the kind of the strapline was a cooperative council, but it was about how the council could move to a role where it was empowering and facilitating communities as distinct to being the service provider to the communities or getting out of the way and assuming the communities would just do it. So there's a different relationship. And I know that we've been tapping into really strong relationships that the community sector and the council have had for a long time, led by colleagues in other parts of the council. I think what's been really interesting is seeing how work like we were doing work on our directory of services, which kind of every council I've ever been in has been looking at. The way that we've been able to build on that to help people find help in the community has been really impressive. The Find Support Services map has been kind of a real hit, both with partners, other colleagues in the council, and it's been well used. And that's sort of an example of where we can do a thing which supports the community sector in its response, but without it needing to be us that's doing all of the responding. The support for people who were either shielding or had significant health concerns, which meant that they couldn't leave their homes, was a real partnership between ourselves and the community sector. So we had the voluntary sector making some of those immediate deliveries. We had the council stepping in and doing some of the stuff which needed to operate at scale. So again, it's finding the things we do best, and then each doing those, and then underpinning that a common sort of understanding of how we can use data and technology to make that integrated, rather than just lots of people in lots of different organisations, big and small, doing stuff. We've had lots of examples of where our work around technology and data has helped provide a glue that joins those things up as part of a kind of a collaborative effort. It's one of the areas I'm really excited about where that might take us.
Similar, so just to build on Rob and what he said, and well done for working in a sauna. It looks really hot in there. So I think the two things that we talk to the voluntary and community sector about at the moment are data, obviously, and the potential for giving them hardware to help people get online in a multiplicity of ways. And they're just really interesting conversations. And then if I'm just going to expand that into something you didn't remotely ask, Gavin, there's something about those relationships which it just made me think as Rob was talking. It's really shifted in my experience from naming the organisation to naming the person in the organisation. Or like, should we talk to mutual aid, or should we talk? Would have been the old way of talking about it. And it's like, oh no, just give Kathy a mutual aid a ring, and here's her number. There's a real immediacy to the relationships there, and the trust networks that I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment. And then the other thing that is really thinking deeply about what the role of the council should be in various different types of relationship, and not needing to fixate on a single pattern. That's a really important bit from my perspective. So maybe we do offer this service, but maybe in a different case we're facilitating this. Maybe in a third case we're just hosting the workshops. And it's this thread that's going through all of this, which is the acknowledgement of multiple potential realities. And it goes back to what Ed was saying about some people are desperate to be in the office, some people are desperate to be anywhere but the office. And you have to now write a building strategy or a future of work strategy or whatever that acknowledges that both of those things are true. Which involves a different set of skills and not a less analytical mindset. If you're of an analytical mindset, you must also acknowledge the emotional reality of what people are going through. But in relation to the VCS, it means that we have to look at multiple delivery models, some of which are not delivery models, they're actually just facilitation models. And that involves a humility that is quite new, I think, because what if people don't need us? What if they need us, but in just really different ways? What if we just need to give them 10 grand and let them get on with it and actually not measure what they do? You know, do we have the leadership that can face that kind of decision and relinquish control? And those are the kind of, I'm always interested in the psychology of this kind of situation, and the psychology of risk for those kind of conversations, I think is really interesting.
The thing is, we're looking at, we were looking at embarking, and I mean, it will continue on to actually look at the needs of, I guess, the digitally excluded people in the community, and what we need to do to, I guess, better prepare them, in this sort of period when they're obviously still digitally excluded, sort of thing. And then we're going to be focusing on community groups and local businesses where we can obviously help to assist those people in being better to be able to, I guess, access online, our online services and things like that.
I actually wanted to come in on Jeremy's point, because I thought it was that whole point around the digital divide is such a kind of interesting thing to reflect on. And we've had interesting conversations in the office about what all of this kind of push to do different may mean for those parts of the community that are traditionally excluded. And actually, in a lot of those conversations, there is something that says we can almost treat that as a group of people who are digitally excluded and try and offer different to them. And that's a perfectly plausible way forward. And that's what councils, I would argue, have done for a long, long time. Or we can actually reflect on the wider context where, less than 6 months ago, if you didn't know how to go online and do your shopping, you pretty much got was delivered to your front door. You lost a choice. So there is something around, can we see that digital exclusion as an opportunity to support people, to empower them, to give them a choice, if you like, where currently they don't have one, and to focus on not how we kind of circumvent the exclusion, but rather how we help to minimize it. There will always be people who are excluded. I get that. But I think more than ever before, it is absolutely clear that part of our remit, part of our focus should be on supporting people to overcome that exclusion. And whether that's by providing them kit, which I think most kind of authorities have done, sorry, not kit personally, obviously, because there's only one kit, but
I take my own name in vain all the time, it's fine. I'm in the wrong career.
Bits of IT kit, or whether that's giving them the skills to use that kit, I think that's what our role should be. And I think it's to focus on the digitally excluded as if it's a problem that we need to solve in terms of how we get around it is absolutely the wrong attitude. I think we need to front up to it and say, how do we reduce it? How do we enable and empower those people to be able to exercise the choices that are increasingly available only online? And if we have another 6 months of lockdown, will again be only available online.
So on that point about exclusion, I think there's huge amounts that we can learn as well from well-designed services. So we can lower the barriers, which means that fewer people are excluded. And actually, if we understand the data in the end-to-end journey, we can link that in with kind of mediated services. So our request for our service to help people ask for food was designed as a digital service, but it was the same service which the customer contact team would guide people through. And the work we've done on the community services data through our directory of services work is now helping us guide helping the contact teams guide people in a conversation to the services that are most likely to help them. So I think if we're thinking about it not as digital exclusion, just as Ed said, just not as a specific problem which is fixed by a device or fixed with some skills, but actually it's about how we design services and how we think about user journeys and how we think about data, where we can start to remove the barriers as well and improve things for people, whether they're accessing online or with a human being.
I mean, when we did the response to the pandemic in Dorset, we worked very much with all our voluntary sector, the town and parish councils, and we tried to fill the gaps that they couldn't fill. So rather than kind of being a bossy council and telling everybody what they all needed to do, we very much tried to lead in a way that was supporting that community response and filling gaps where obviously people couldn't step in. And I think we worked really well with all the people across Dorset who mobilised themselves and supported their own communities to do various things, their neighbours, etc., etc. But we haven't really got down to the nitty-gritty of what that would look like from a digital point of view. What we did very much was lead in a way where we got everyone together in a meeting. You know, it started off every day actually, but then it turned into sort of 3 times a week to just coordinate, you know, medicines delivery, food delivery, and who was doing what and who was looking after each other. It was actually in some ways quite a low-tech solution, although obviously it involved video calls, but it worked very effectively.
Slightly contentiously, I don't think so. I think there is something around the role that local gov plays with its communities that to me feels different. So, you know, I don't think the strategy around tech or digital is any different. Stuff may have moved faster than we anticipated, but broadly the same direction fundamentally. What I think has changed, and someone referred to it earlier on, is the way we increasingly see ourselves as part of a system. And that system includes the VCS, it includes our communities, it includes, you know, it includes all the people and all the organizations that work and operate in the place. And for me, that's the thing that requires, you know, that's the thing that hones in on the data challenge and how we are better able to support each other, to collaborate around the needs of the people that we serve.
Yeah, I will be emphasizing some things more than I would otherwise have done. Things like the ability to remote work, which leads you to a quicker shift to cloud-based infrastructure and other things like that. But I agree with Ed that that's just kind of that's the tech, that's the easy bit, right? The bit that I think is more complicated, not more interesting, because I think it's all interesting, but the bit that's more complicated is that this is the first time that I think en masse we've done intentional service design for services which were previously taken for granted. So, you know, it could be processing council tax discount applications, or it could be certain element. Well, it's certainly certain elements for internal governance, things which aren't routinely questioned because they are the way they are. And, you know, I think there's an opportunity to bring in service designers and service design practice and systems thinking, and the ability. That's sort of the ability to think more strategically, but it's also the ability to think more intentionally and to question more aspects of how you operate. So I really think that's a huge difference. And you know, in a case in point, and it picks up on what somebody said before, I was asked to do something the other day, which, and then print this out, and then you're going to need to physically sign it. And I said, well, that ain't happening. And the first question back to me was, the first comment back was, there's a requirement that we provide a signature. And then you dig, and of course there is no requirement. And then I didn't provide the signature. And there's a doggedness about that. And that's what will revolutionize certainly internal services and processes, is the service design that comes from a constant questioning.
Oh, I do agree on the whole. I mean, we were already going down that whole, cloud proposition before this all came out. And like I say, we're moving our DR and our BCP to, an off-site location and things like that. So, I mean, that was always our intention anyway. And I mean, all it does is assist with the way that we're going as far as, preparing to enable the organisation to work better.
So I think before the pandemic, and I look across at the sort of embryonic plans we had with the council coming together, I think we did think a lot of this transformation was just about buying new pieces of IT equipment that was kind of line of business, best of breed, whatever we'd call it. I think what we've realised is having to mobilise, 2,500 people to work from home overnight, having redeployed about 250 people into roles that they would never have done before in order to support the pandemic. What we've realized is we need much better customer data that's shared across. We need a much greater view of our customers from different angles that we can pull together, and with our health colleagues. And so I think what that has done is that has kind of eroded some of people's previous arguments about, well, I need this because it's the best thing for me to do X for my line of business, because actually people can see that having to react in the way that we have as a whole council response, where lots of different things came to play that we wouldn't have ever necessarily brought together ever before, that having that more joined up approach, that more easily developed kind of Lego bricks, digital platform, which we're shortly going to invest in, is the way to go. And I think we will have far less problems with persuading some of my other corporate director colleagues to give up their shiny piece of technology that's just for them, and actually come into a more, I suppose, corporate way of doing things, but a more joined up way of doing things, I think, is really.
So we've heard from a group of digital, technology and transformation leaders embedded in delivering local government's response to the pandemic. They've shared how their teams pivoted within hours and days to focus on getting staff out of council offices, providing devices, scaling up server and network capacity, and enabling the remote working services that they needed. Some were in the fortunate position of already having a modern internet-first infrastructure and devices that were designed for mobile. But other councils had to make hasty compromises and deal with barriers. I know that many of the sessions this week in Local Gov Camp 2020 will share practical responses and solutions that digital teams and their suppliers built rapidly in the first days and weeks of lockdown. I hope that we've given you some context, a look at the bigger picture and early thinking about what's next that started a few months into lockdown. People began asking what the new normal would be and how to redesign completely new organizations. As we face new restrictions this autumn and confront potentially another 6 months of the pandemic, I've heard people say that it doesn't really make sense to talk about recovery in the way that councils normally think about post-crisis management. There's no real recovery in sight yet. We're simply learning to live with COVID and resetting how we operate. As you heard, for most councils, the themes that we've been discussing have been there for the past 10 years or more. They were already part of the challenge and context for CDIOs and their teams 5 years ago when I led digital transformation in Bristol. They've led to some of the new structures and roles that we've seen in leading councils over the past couple of years. And the acceleration in the value of those roles, structures and services that COVID-19 has forced could move us all in a positive direction. That's going to be very dependent on the mindset of council leaders and chief executives, on their vision and the ability to act boldly. For me, more than ever before, we need to match the needs of our users and the vision of our leaders with digital capabilities and infrastructure that are fit for purpose in a world where communities and partners fill the gaps that councils cannot cover. We need to move beyond reinventing digital services from scratch to reusable building blocks and open digital platforms that support the whole place. We need an open ecosystem within which everyone can play their part locally. that's how we can begin to build back better.